up, Lina. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to present my paper. I'm grateful to you for this opportunity. I will be brief and just convey the succinctly, hopefully, the essential points arising from a recent article published in the Asian Journal of WTO and Health Law published in Taiwan. And the title of my paper, as you can see, is The Americanization of the International Economic Order. But at the outset, I would say this is not really about the United States as such. I'm more interested as a scholar in the phenomenon of a superpower in the international economic arena and the accommodation of a superpower, an economic superpower in the international economic order. The essential focus is this underlying problem as to how we should be able to manage in an international economic order a superpower, whether there are special considerations that should be thought about in this context. I would also state at the outset that this is not intended to be an anti-American exercise in any form. It's simply an academic query of an issue that the international community should focus on. And the reason why the international community should focus on this issue is because the United States has been very proactive historically in the shaping of the international economic architecture. As we all know, it was very prominent in delivering key institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions post the Second World War. And it has continued with that proactive approach to international economic relations. It is, of course, a big economy, a very major economy, and therefore anything that it does, both in terms of economic policy and in terms of the use of that economic might in shaping the international economic order, is something that one should be aware of and focus on. Most of the legal analysis in international economic relations, and even I'm guilty of it, is that we tend to focus on the Bretton Woods institutions and international economic organizations and come to describe the normative framework of international economic law from those platforms. But given the size of the United States, given its prominence and influence, there is a case to look at US law, US processes and activities and engagements in the international economic system, so that we can better understand what really underpins the legal system that exists currently, and also in order to understand the totality of the normative framework that applies to anyone. For example, if you are an importer from a state, you need to know not only what market access are guaranteed to you under the WTO regime, but also in case there are any UN sanctions that are relevant to your export product. So to get a complete picture, even at a practical level, you need to understand the US foreign economic policy and practice. So that's the importance and the reasons why one should look at the US engagement in international economic relations. How does US engagement in international economic relations really take place, and how does the Americanization of the international economic system take place? There are various processes by which this happens. US is a major player in international key international economic organizations. In some cases, it has a greater say in the decision making, for example, through the weighted voting system in the World Bank and the IMF, and also in the context of where decisions are made through consensus, it is able to sustain a veto when decisions are made through consensus. I should say also that I will revert back to what I was saying, but one of the reasons why I was inspired to look at this subject was because of the current trade war between China and the United States. And that trade war is actually a manifestation, on one view at least, of the Americanization of the international economic order. It brings out the issues and problems that I'm trying to focus on. Anyway, to go back to the processes by which the United States engages in its influence in the international economic arena. The transplantation of US law into the international system and also into the domestic systems of countries. Many countries have adopted, based their legislation in different spheres on US law, have adopted US law. International agreements, for example, the WTO anti-dumping agreement borrows from the historical practice in this field. The United States, of course, has been very popular and known to exercise extraterritorial jurisdiction. In other words, for those of you who are not lawyers, the United States often applies its law to activities and individuals outside its territory. And through that, it again brings to bear its normative framework on others. And finally, US economic sanctions. So different processes by which the United States engages in influencing and imparting certain normative models that reflect its either its vision of international economic relations in certain respects, or its ideological basis, or even its own self-interests, as the case may be. So this is the way the process of Americanization takes place. Is there a process that actually results in Americanization? Well, social scientists will tell you, and we all know, for example, the McDonaldization of cultures, the exportation of American values through exports of goods and services. So I propose to focus on two aspects of this phenomenon, namely the phenomenon of a superpower and its accommodation in the international economic order, by firstly generally looking at the relationship between economic power and the rule of law. And secondly, by looking at some of the instruments or measures that are used by a superpower to implement its vision of a particular issue. Firstly, insofar as the relationship between economic power and the rule of law is concerned, this is nothing new. International relations and international political analysts and legal philosophers have been engaging in this discourse as to the relationship between law and power. And that discourse is there and continues to be there. I just want to say here that but this debate is not over. It is an ongoing discourse, the relationship between power and law. And certainly one can discern in the economic sphere, if not elsewhere, two different schools of thought. One is the realist approach that power is something that you have to accept and take it as given. And another is a more resistant approach to this relationship. And it wouldn't be, I mean, it wouldn't surprise you that I guess I'm one of the resistors in that respect. But more importantly, I think the challenge for lawyers and scholars is really how to manage power, not so much to accept that there is that important relationship as a given. Now, looking at this relationship from three different perspectives, firstly, the dispute settlement context, economic power and dispute settlement. This has been highlighted very much from the recent impasse in the WTO with respect to the US paralyzing the appellate system of the WTO. And a number of writers, there is much that's been written, but in 2011, as far back as 2011, Colares, an American academic, argued in a very prominent international economic law journal that excessive legalism and excessive legalism and a lack of a special accommodation of a superpower will drive the superpower outside the system. And essentially, Colares was arguing in his article as long ago as 2011 that there is the logic of power requires us to be a little more flexible and accommodating insofar as the question of the implementation of judicial decisions are concerned in the WTO. So I, in my paper, critique his argument, of course, but what I would accept, I wouldn't go into the reasons now because my brief is to speak for 20 minutes here. But what I would say is that Colares' argument is very provocative in the sense that he's asking for preferential treatment for a superpower in the context of dispute settlement. It is provocative, but nevertheless, it does, I think, given what has happened now, given the withdrawal effectively of, sorry, not the withdrawal, but the paralysis of the appellate body system of the WTO, there is at least room. We should be open, even though he's provocative, and it goes very much against the grain of the rule of law that we understand, that there should be some discussion about this. There should be some discourse about this. Moving on to decision making in international organizations. Again, the US veto for the appointments of appellate body judges in the appellate body has resulted in the suspension of the operation of the appellate body. But I think that in the context of the WTO, it is possible to argue that the US engagement in that process, the use of its veto, is actually an abuse of power. And what it has done is that it has deprived the membership of an important benefit that the membership had argued for, and therefore the decision of the United States to veto can be challenged. Whatever the analysis one might come here with respect to WTO law, the lesson to learn here is that with respect to decision making in international economic organizations, is that whereas we have been very much concerned about how to facilitate the voice of developing countries in decision making in international organizations, and we have accepted that where you have economic powers that make greater contributions to international organizations, that they should have a greater weight in the decision making of that organization. However, the lesson here is that in future, we should ensure that that privileged position accorded to both developing countries and a developed superpower in the decision-making process or in other respects, that there are appropriate checks and balances with respect to the way in which that privileged decision-making is being availed. So, for example, perhaps one might think about ensuring parliamentary approval before a veto on a vital issue is concerned, or even ensuring, I venture to say, somewhat provocatively, awareness training for relevant decision makers in countries. Not long ago, when men had to undergo gender awareness training when they were involved in recruitment and promotion exercises, there was from some horror, at least some years back, but we've now all adjusted to that. So there are ways of ensuring a proportionate, measured exercise of decision making in international organizations that should be thought about at the time of creation or reforming the system. Another manifestation of economic power comes from the fact that the nature of international trade has now changed, that the rules of international trade derive from a time where trade was mainly in unprocessed goods. We now are in a different era where products are processed, and the processing, the more processed they are, the more they can have attributes of they can have aesthetic attributes, cultural attributes, social attributes, civilizational attributes. In other words, the products that we trade in and the services that we trade in are not just don't just have functional attributes. They also have certain other non-economic, non-functional attributes. And therefore, if you are in a situation where you command a big market and you're a big economy, my point is, given this background, there needs to be a responsibility, a reflection in the way we engage in international trade. Now, normally in scholarly work, one would resort to quoting Kelsen and other legal philosophers, but I'm resorting actually to my favorite fiction, Star Trek. I think all of you perhaps are aware of the series Star Trek, the exploration, fictional exploration of Earthlings into space. And in Star Trek, the one interesting thing that the explorers of different planets have is this prime directive. The prime directive in Star Trek is about refraining from interfering in the cultural and other development of the society. In other words, that if you encounter new aliens, you do not interfere in their life and the progress of their life and self-development by, for example, giving them high-tech machinery and so on. So the same applies here, that there is a case where, to recognize that not only do states have the right to stop the importation on the grounds of morality, culture, environment, and so on, but also those who are engaged in international trade at a certain level have a duty, a responsibility, a moral responsibility, if not certainly not a legal duty at the moment, to reflect upon the what they are exporting. You know, for example, if you trust upon a nation the importation of various aircrafts, then you are affecting. You are not just selling a vehicle that for transportation. You are actually affecting the way of living of another country. You are actually affecting the environment to effect of the use of that. So it's not just about imparting with a vehicle that you are imparting. There are non-functional attributes there in that way. Okay, moving on. Now, the China-US trade war raises two distinct questions. One is, of course, the legality of the trade war, which the WTO law essentially is informed by. But another question is, regardless of the legality of the trade war, are there any rules, responsibilities that are set in international law or ethical considerations that should go in the way in which a trade war is conducted? And are there any lessons, for example, from comparable regimes in international law? So there certainly are lessons to be learned from international humanitarian law, as you all probably know, that in international law, there is the law on the use of force, which focuses on the legality and legitimacy of the use of force. And then you have international humanitarian law, which is distinct from that question, and it is about conducting the war in a humanitarian manner. Various principles of international humanitarian law are relevant. For example, the distinction between civil and armed combatants, the prohibition on indiscriminate measures, disproportionate measures, unnecessary suffering of civilians, the types of weapons used. I think that we can extrapolate principles from the way in which international humanitarian law has evolved to crafting a set of code of conducts for the way in which trade wars are conducted. So in conclusion, I would say that the relationship between law and power, and that relationship is not necessarily one that has to be swayed in terms of power, but there is a way, even if a soft way of managing this power. The challenge for us is to try and understand, to see how how a superpower can be accommodated, and to discuss this upfront, which it needs to be discussed upfront as a specific issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Asif, for this really very interesting presentation. I'm sure many of the participants have questions, but I'm going to use my privilege as the chair to comment and ask a few questions. First of all, I've learned something, the use of the principle of non-interference in domestic affairs in the series Star Trek. That's really something I didn't think about, and I'm looking forward to reading your article on non-interference in Star Trek. But to be a bit more serious, you're posing a number of very important questions which are actually informing today's crisis, because there's a lot of trade in today's crisis. The first comment or question I have, and that's a typical comment, I suppose, that you've been asked this question before. Do you really think that there is such thing as an international economic order? Because of course you refer to the Bretton Woods institution with the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and to a lesser extent, of course, the GATT and World Trade Organization. But has there ever been an international trade order when this order was first imposed upon others by the West, to simplify, and also because today it's certainly very much contested by the US itself? The second question or comment I have relates to this question of extraterritoriality. It's a very well-known question for international lawyers, but maybe you could elaborate slightly upon that, because there is, again, a lot of extraterritoriality today in the crisis, and generally speaking, in American vision of international law. So it was explaining that further for our colleagues and all the participants here. So I'll limit my comments and questions to these two, and then I'll give the floor to everyone. Everyone, just a few rules. Please keep your mics muted. If you want to ask question, type the question in the chat bar so that I can see them, say them to Asif, and maybe then you can unmute your mic and turn on your camera.
Okay, thank you for those interesting questions. I hadn't expected the first question, certainly. And I think I would react in the same way as I would when I'm teaching international law, and to quote, I think, Harris in his classical work on cases and materials in international law, where he, when talking about is there an international law and why do states obey international law, analogizes this, namely that the incidents of non-compliance in international law are like the situation when man bites dog. Okay, and I think not perhaps to the same extent, but that's largely also the case in terms of the international economic order. There is an international economic order out there, certainly, but as I think my focus is, but perhaps that the location of the relevant decision making may be placed in different locations. So I'd say, yes, there is an international economic order. It is functioning even now, despite the paralysis of the appellate body. As we know, countries that have been affected have set up an alternate appellate system pending a long-term solution in the WTO. And even the United States itself is actually litigating in the WTO, as we know. So there's a system that is certainly functioning there, more or less. Extraterritorial exercise of jurisdiction takes place in different areas of international economic law. In taxation, it happens in antitrust, in other spheres, in the environmental sphere, and so on. Essentially, what that is that the US passes a law that applies to conduct outside its territory, and it enforces that where the entity or individual has assets within the United States, or when the individual or entity wants to engage or come to the United States, then the enforcement takes place in that way. The problem with extraterritorial jurisdiction is that it creates a democratic deficit, in the sense that individuals outside the United States are being subjected to a normative framework that they weren't party to in its formulation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Asif, for these very clear responses. Speaking about the democratic deficit, we have a question from Dr. Ramani Garimella from South Asian University in Delhi. Ramani asked, Professor Qureshi referred to the crisis in dispute resolution and the right of states to call for US to clear appointments to the appellate body. So for those of you who don't know, there is no such thing as WTO dispute settlement mechanism now, because the US has refused to support the appointment of new judges, to make it simple. Ramani asked, I'm wondering if we could suggest on possible ways to go ahead on states ensuring US participates in the division of the crisis at the appellate body in the context of a rule of law. So that's for the question. And then Ramani, if you want to add up on your question once Asif has responded, feel free to unmute yourself.
Okay, I'm just going by what you are saying. The question is, because I can't read anything here on my screen. So as I understand, the question is whether the United States can be persuaded to engage in the dispute settlement of the WTO. Yes, that the United States is actually participating in the dispute settlement system. It has initiated claims in the WTO. The dispute settlement system has not disappeared. It's only a particular part of the dispute settlement system that is currently suspended. And importantly, the US actually, in terms of its critique of the appellate system, of the WTO system, what it hasn't said is, we are powerful, we decide not to. What it has done is, in other words, it has given reasons. It has given reasons which we may or may not be persuaded by, but it has given reasons for the actions that it has taken. In other words, it is still engaging in the system that ensures the rule of law. I'm not sure, I didn't understand the question completely, so but I think that's what I understood.
I think that's a very good answer. Ramani, do you want to add up? I think Ramani was also asking, how do we overcome the current crisis at the appellate body?
Well, I think what's currently happening is an important step in the process of overcoming. That is the setting up of an alternate system of an appellate system, an alternate appellate system. It has taken some time for us to come there, but it has happened. And the pressure will continue on the United States sooner or later, I think, to come to the fold and engage. I guess because I'm an international economic lawyer, I tend to be more optimistic about the system that we engage in somehow through too much association with it. But I feel that this is a question of time and political regimes in the United States.
Yeah, thanks very much, Asif. Well, colleagues, feel free to ask questions, preferably in writing. This is just easier. But if not, you unmute your mic and you ask your question. But again, preferably in writing. While we are waiting for new questions from colleagues from law firms in India and also Mavjohn, or colleagues from faculties, different places in the world, ask another one. Can you explain further, Asif, why today's situation, like the COVID-19 crisis, is also a trade war and what implication it has for international law?
The coronavirus is a trade war. It's a very challenging and difficult question. States are, of course, competing for essential medical items, and I don't see it though as a trade war. But I certainly think that this pandemic will mean. Is making us all think and will mean a reshaping and rethinking of the international order and the international economic order that will follow. And it's a good question whether it will impact upon globalization as we come to know it, or whether there will be some fine-tuning in the process of globalization that we now find ourselves in.
Thank you so much, Asif. Asif, very much in relation to that question from Justice Mahmood Sheikh, if I'm not mistaken, who's Justice in Lahore High Court. Mahmood, you would like to unmute your mic and ask your question. The question is, how will COVID-19 impact the trade wars, especially in relation to oil?
Yes, yes, that is the question. Because the question I had in mind, you had already asked, that how would COVID-19 impact the trade wars and globalization, as Asif has mentioned. But recently there has been development where oil prices have plummeted. Do you think this would have a long-term effect on the price of oil and availability or supply of oil? Because once we are rid of COVID-19, it would obviously take a long time for world economies to get back into sync. And in the meantime, if obviously price slashing is there, then the countries would be forced to go after each other for oil and other essential items. So what are your views on that, Asif?
Thank you for.
I made myself clear.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I would say, firstly, there's one aspect to that question which perhaps I'm not an economist, so there's an economic aspect to that question. But what I would say, and the way I would respond to your question, is really that the pandemic has made us all think about priorities and in the scale of the things and the way it is affecting humanity right now. A trade war between two nations becomes, you have to look at it in perspective now, that trade war. And even approaching it, I would think, given the greater calamity that we are confronted with. In other words, that the issues that the trade war was concerned with is now dwarfed by the calamity of the situation we are confronted with, and perhaps it may inform the handling of the trade war between China and the United States.
Thank you so much, Asif. We have a few more questions. We have one from Aditya. I'm reading from for everyone. How to interpret or determine the contours of other emergency in international relation mentioned under the Article 21 of the GATT while imposing restriction. It's indeed a very important question. Article 21 of the GATT. And then, is there a principle of constitutionalism applicable or found under international economic law? If it is, then to what extent the courts and tribunals exercise the power of judicial review, or what will be the standard of review for the state? So about the Article 21 of the GATT in the context of emergencies, and we can think about economic emergency, obviously, as a consequence of the consequences, and then a more broader question on the principle of constitutionalism in international economic law. So that's a question from Aditya. And then I have another one, but I'll let you first respond to this one.
Okay. The Article 21 of GATT, the national security exception for non-compliance with WTO obligations, has for the first time been the subject of adjudication and panel decision. And in that context, the positive and the welcome clarification that the panel introduced here was that resort to national security defense aspects of that resort are justiciable, can be looked at by the WTO tribunals. Hitherto, there was some uncertainty about that, whether this was something completely in the domain of the country invoking the national security exception. But the Article 21 is very specific to the way it is drafted and formulated there. I think the panel actually has come up with a right decision insofar as it allows for jurisdiction and examination of resort to national security. The one thing that, in terms of what I'm discussing here, it defined a national emergency and a situation of war to exclude economic war or economic differences between countries, but only unless the economic differences are affecting the public order of the country in question, and public order of the country in question. And that's fine, because ambit of that interpretation means that Article 21 cannot be abused. If circumstances in which it can be invoked are defined very broadly, then it means that Article 21 could be resorted to by more easily. Constitutionalism and international economic law, judicial review. I think Uli Petersman, who's written a lot on in this area, is probably the best person to ask the question. And judicial review is a domestic remedy, depends on domestic systems, whether they make it available or not.
Thank you so much, Asif. These were not very easy questions and yet extremely important. For those of you who are not international trade law specialists, it seems technical, but it's actually very key in particular today. In relation to the crisis we have today, I have two similar questions coming from our colleague Anu Monga, who's heading a trade department in a law firm in Delhi, and Ramani adding up upon that. So Anu's question was quite long and had two aspects, but I'm just going to say one because it relates to what Ramani says. So following the COVID-19 crisis in India, and I think elsewhere in the world, there is a new FDI, foreign direct investment regulatory environment, and precisely this prohibits investment from neighbors to avoid opportunistic buyout of companies in difficulty, for example, during the crisis. So obviously, China says it's discriminatory. Do you think it's discriminatory for countries like India, and there are other examples, to introduce new foreign direct investment regulation to limit these foreign direct investment during the crisis?
Well, I mean, this really depends on the investment, bilateral investment agreement in question that we are talking about. And if we're talking about India and China, for instance, and there is a bilateral investment agreement between India and China, then it is something that would be informed by that agreement. But the question of acquisition through mergers is something that is about the right of entry rather than post-entry. If that's what it is, then usually states reserve the right of entry of investment into investment agreements. So I mean, I can't answer that question unless it's more contextualized in terms of the specifics of the question. But bilateral investment agreement is what will inform the answer.
Yeah, that's right. As if it's quite complex. I think these go even beyond the normal bilateral investment, more in the sense of additional procedural rules sometimes. But in relation to this investment question, we have a question from Wasik Abbas. The question is the following: post-COVID crisis, would you see a further surge in Americanization of the international economic order, or should we expect a radical shift in the approach?
No, I think that, of course, it does, you know, I didn't define at the outset what I meant by Americanization as such. Americanization can be interpreted as the implantation of American values into the system, or you can interpret it as well as the withdrawal of the United States from the international economic system, or I guess the de-Americanization of the international economic order. So it may be, I mean, given the current climate in the United States and the protectionism and the pandemic has made people think about food security, medical security, and national security more. that the international economic order will change, and the US will doubtless take a lead in that reshaping of the international economic order.
Thank you so much, Asif. Do we have another last question? Yes, we do. A question again from Mamu. COVID-19 related. Forcible purchase of essential medical equipment by a superpower. Example of the US forcing supply of N95 masks to it in exclusion of to other countries. So that's also one of the reasons I was saying it's a bit of a trade war, because some countries are trying to have access to certain necessities, and these are the masks first. So how would you react to that? And that's going to be our last question.
Well, I mean, I think that this is more a question of demand and supply rather than the question that we are discussing, namely how the United States is and has been able to shape the architecture of the international economic order.
All right, I understand. Thank you so much, Asif. We're coming to a close, so I'd like to thank really very much Asif Qureshi, Professor Qureshi, for a very interesting presentation. Thank absolutely everyone, all the participants coming from all over the world, from Korea, India, Pakistan, China, Europe, the UK. It was great to have you here. Next week, we're going to discuss what's the future of international development policy post-crisis. So that's, again, a very important question, knowing that, as you may have seen, the World Food Programme is probably planning a form of hunger internationally. So what sort of development aid policy are we going to be able to provide to the developing world? A very pressing question. And the week after, we'll discuss with Professor Gordon Bloom, who's heading the theme Health and Wellbeing at the university. We'll discuss the question of public health policies. So thanks very much again, everyone, and very much looking forward to having you next week. Thank you so much, Asif, for this great presentation.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shokman. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.
Everyone, if you want to say something more personal or to ask if we're still here. If not, it's very late in Korea, so maybe we let Asif go to sleep.
It's not yet 12 o'clock. It's 11 o'clock.
Except for a good night. I'd like to thank you for inviting me to the lecture. Very informative. And is it possible to have a copy of your article? I'm sorry I'm asked for it so late in the day.
Yes, of course. Of course, it is possible. I'll send it to you.
Yes. Oh, okay. Thanks very much. Take care. And thank you, Laila.
Most welcome. Thanks very much for participating.
Thank you. Welcome. Bye-bye.
Okay, well, I don't know if you're still here, Asif, but
Yeah,
all right, you're still here? Okay, so I think that's all we have for now in terms of questions and answers, unless you want to have more questions, but I think it's time for Asif to rest.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I'm going to close down the system and stop the
Okay.
recording now. Thanks very much, everyone.
Bye now. Bye. Bye.